All right. Well, welcome to this special edition of Meet the Miniaturist. I have a special guest with me today, Troy Bettridge. Yay! From Tulsa Tiny Stuff. I found you on Instagram, as I find most of these folks in the miniatures world. Very struck by sort of your eye, and you're a collector, you're a curator. I understand you have an architectural background, but I'm really struck by the types of miniatures you collect. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And so let's get to it. So talk a little bit about your background in miniatures, how you got here, and then we'll get into the kinds of miniatures that I'd love to talk about today.
Sounds good. So I think that my first experience with miniatures, specifically antique miniatures, was my great-grandmother's house. She had a shoebox full of antique furniture. I later found out it was Cage brand. But every time I would go to her house, I would like to drag that box out and play with that stuff. And then after she passed away, I wanted the box, and I kept adding to the Cage collection. So I had that. So I think that was kind of my first experience with kind of real miniatures. But on the other side of things, as you probably know, when Star Wars came out in 1977, I started collecting the Star Wars stuff. And then I found out that the Tommy miniatures were the same scale as Star Wars. So I would build houses for my Star Wars figures, spaceships for them, and then I would get the Tommy furniture and use that with them also. So I was kind of, as a child, always doing that. And then as I got a little bit older in high school, I actually built from scratch, just 1:12 scale house, and started collecting miniatures. Actual miniatures, 1:12 that we know today.
And where is that 12 scale house today? Do you still have it?
I have pieces of it. So I'm from rural northern Nevada, and that was a long time ago. So I started college in Idaho and then transferred to Las Vegas, and then out here to Oklahoma. So the house was just kind of too big to manage. So I cut it into pieces, and I still have pieces of it that I use here and there. And someday I'll put it back together, I guess.
Yeah. So your collection is pretty broad and varied, but it really does center around vintage miniatures, would you say?
Vintage.
Why don't you
antique,
describe that? Yeah.
So I've always been drawn to antiques and to history and architecture, and I think that's kind of why I wanted to be an architect and be able to design. There's just something intrinsic about it within me that draws me to be able to create spaces. It's to escape reality a little bit, but to be able to build models and be able to kind of encompass and see the whole thing that you're working with, instead of the unknown,
Yeah. So when did the collecting bug hit you? Have you always been a collector, or did a period of time come and you're like, you just start to acquire? When and how did that begin?
Well, like I said, I started building my first house while I was in high school. That was 1:12, and that was kind of towards the end of, I know we're going to get into some vintage miniatures, but the Concord miniatures was real big in the country. And I even pulled a few of those pieces to show you that I still have the boxes, but I started buying just pieces, that I could afford, that were the right scale and a little bit nicer, and started there. And then, like I said, I started when I figured out that my grandmother's furniture was Cage brand. I started adding on to that and seeing that, and I don't know. I did kind of just start collecting. If people are interested in collecting, I would suggest a few books like the Diane Zillner books, or she goes through kind of by decades and brands and collections, and I just would see things and think, I can do that. I'm fortunate to live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was very wealthy during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s due to oil. And so there's a lot of stuff here from those periods. So there's a lot of estate sales and garage sales. I like to go on my lunch hour, look at those and find things. And I just started getting collections going, and then I started my blog. I started putting them on my blog. Initially, my blog was to kind of ask for information about pieces or try to understand them, and then it kind of evolved from that, where I started doing scenes and kind of doing more into architecture sort of things. But
so how I mean, I wanted to talk specifically about these vintage miniatures, like from the 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s and 50s, because I'm actually working on an estate sale right now that I've acquired of a whole bunch of these pieces, and there's something so awesome about them. But I wanted to talk to you because I know you have a fair number of them, and you're like the area expert in like sort of this genre, if you will. But like those brands that you just mentioned, Concord and Cage is a brand new brand. I did not hear about that. But Concord Miniatures, what are some of the brands that define that sort of era? And how would you define the types of miniatures that those are compared to what, let's say, we see today in the miniatures world?
Yeah, well, it's been interesting when you go back and look at miniatures the past 50 or 100 years. You know, they started out as kind of blocky wooden toys, where when we got into, the world got into mass production of things.
Right.
And so, you know, the 20s, 30s, 40s, it was real blocky, kind of the same Art Deco style of furniture. And then over the years, you know, the Strombecker and more companies started refining it a little bit, using better woods, staining wood instead of painting it. Arcade cast iron, you know, they started trying to make things more durable. They also copied things from real life, you know, plumbing fixtures, brands, sinks, you know, the same brands that we have today, Kohler and all the plumbing, they would actually use those same models and copy those to make them toys. I think there was a little bit of, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think the word you used was refined, and I think that's a really good word that I think defines that transition from the blocky, which is another good word you use, to the more refined, more real life, but still not what we see today. And it definitely was an evolution, but they got better at it, right? And why do you think they got better at it?
Well, I think the manufacturing processes got better. I think the kind of the shift in labor, being able to send things overseas, people having more disposable income, I think that all kind of contributed to the pieces getting better. You know, in the 40s and 50s, they started doing the plastic furniture, Renwall and Ideal, at different scales. And then companies also started just doing nicer wood and trying to copy, you know, things that were during those periods. They copied what was popular at that time. I think as we got more into the 60s and especially the 70s, you know, when it was the country's bicentennial, and the whole country kind of went back to this whole colonial revival, which led into the Victorian houses and stuff that's so prevalent in the 70s and 80s.
Wow.
But a lot of the stuff from the 70s is kind of antique looking or colonial style, Victorian style.
Yeah.
Actually, go ahead.
But do you think there were a couple of things happening? Because like Concord was artistry, you know, artisan made, right? They were handcrafted. But then you also had these other brands that weren't necessarily hand artisan. Like, were there two things happening at that time?
I think so. I mean, I think there was a little bit of there were like two different things going on for sure. There were people who could afford more expensive things and nicer woods, and people would buy those miniatures. And then there were the regular working collar person who wanted miniatures for their daughters, and so those were more manufactured, simple designs. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, then that's when adults started getting more into miniatures and collecting. And I think they were willing to spend a little bit more money and looking more at the design and the aesthetic of things, as opposed to just having a chair or a stove or whatever. They wanted something that looked more realistic and would fit within their aesthetic.
So would you say that you were mostly inspired by that shoebox filled with miniatures in terms of what you're drawn to today?
Probably. I think that really sort of affected me. As a child, just thinking that was so cool. And the Cage brand stuff, it's mostly stained wood, but there's also upholstered pieces. And so it was just always fascinating to me to have kind of a little bit of history, but something that was tangible and you could play with it, but yet they were from history, so I was trying to, I don't know, I've always enjoyed.
Yeah. And if you had to pick a favorite brand that you like to collect, that you like, you have all your Google alerts set on, what would you say?
Well, I think that my favorite brand, which I haven't touched on, is Tiny Toy, which is from the 20s through the 30s and 40s, but they were more expensive and geared more towards kind of the upper class, based on actual furniture design. But that was all nice woods, hand-painted furniture. The two women who founded that company hired students from the Rhode Island School of Design to hand paint each piece, and they were in more, expensive department stores. So I love to collect Tiny Toy. I love the history of that company.
I know you have some samples of some vintage pieces. I don't know if you have Tiny Toys there represented there. Would love to see that.
I didn't grab Tiny Toy, but I grabbed more of the stuff from like the 40s, 50s, 60s, more vintage.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah, so, for sure.
One of the, I've just pulled together some trays here, but one of the larger brands, Shackman especially. It was just more blocky.
Right. Yep. And those
simple
pieces
design.
seem to be in very good condition. Very good condition.
Yeah, some of them are. A lot of the hardware's not real delicate, but they started getting into working doors and drawers and
that telephone is so iconic. That telephone must have been reproduced in every brand. I had that when I was a kid. It's just iconic.
And so
those little
that's
chairs,
an early Shackman one.
Those little
Shackman
red
also
and blue
got
chairs.
Shackman also got into accessories. They have their own packaging. I don't know if you can see them there, but there's still some eyeglasses in there.
I could see it. Now, did they have a shop in New York City? Did Shackman have a store in New York City?
They were based out of New York. So they imported from all over the world, but they did a lot of that. So there was Shackman, and then there was foamers. A lot of the
piece too I had as a kid. Oh my gosh, it's just taking it back. Foamer,
brands. They do a lot of these painted things too that they would import from around the world, China and Germany.
And when you're collecting, what do you look for? I mean, obviously good condition is really, really important. Are there some pieces that are more rare than others? Is there something that you are like, is on your list you must have, you're constantly looking for? I mean, like, talk about that, like the finds.
Well, there was, I've kind of got a lot of collections going that I'm pretty happy with, but while I was collecting the arcade cast iron pieces, I was always looking for the pieces that I didn't have. There's a living room table and a side table that I couldn't find for a long time, or they were always out of my price range. Or in the Cage brand, there's a grandfather clock, and it took 10 years to finally find one of those, so to kind of complete that collection. So it was always once you have it, then you have the complete collection. Then I was kind of onto something else.
Yeah. What is a brand that you might not have what is a next sort of collection for you that you're just starting or looking to start?
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of I think maybe going away from brands and just kind of going more towards the artistic side of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I've done
talk a little bit about
a few
that.
crazy projects. The radio that's behind me, that's where I actually have my arcade cast iron furniture.
Right.
And then I did a clock shop inside of the case of an antique clock case. And then I recently just acquired a really, really cool old suitcase that has all the travel stickers on it and stuff. And I've always thought it'd be cool just to maybe do that into an architectural piece, rooms and windows, stuff inside of that.
So it's less about collecting the individual pieces, but finding the pieces that will make up a complete piece, whether it's something in a clock box or building these dioramas, or I don't know, what do you call them?
Yeah, definitely. And then, since the 80s, I've been collecting, I mentioned Concord Miniatures. They were a huge brand after Shackman and stuff. They were in the 70s and 80s, and I pulled out some of those pieces too. It's kind of neat just to even look at the in the early 70s, they had the kind of their own graphic style of the pieces. Again, they're kind of clunky looking compared to some of the finer, but they're fun to have. This was a piece that I actually bought when we were on vacation when I was a kid. I thought it was pretty cool, a Victorian, washstand with the swivel mirror. I was just looking at that today, and I'm like, I think I had the box for that. I see I paid $2 for it back then, but that was kind of cool. And Concord made they had accessories that they sold also. Lamps. And
you keep everything in the box. You keep everything and you keep the packages.
Not everything, but
that's a true collector.
So now. Yeah.
More
but
so
you can
now,
just see their stuff is a little more bulky and not as refined as stuff you can find today.
Yeah, I made a mistake. Before, when I mentioned the artistic brand, it was Chestnut Hill that I was thinking of, not Concord. Concord is very much one of the brands like a Shackman.
Yes.
Those blocky brands. But it was Chestnut Hill that was sort of around the 30s and 40s that was more artistic.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking of. But I thought it was fascinating what you said about how, they got more refined because the buyer became the adult. So it became the transition happened because you had an adult buyer looking for a much more refined piece. So would you say that helped sort of propel the transition from those, I'm going to call them blocky brands, to more artistic brands of the makers of the 70s and the 80s?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this the other day, in fact, when I was thinking about what we might discuss today. And, this led to the whole, the House of Miniatures. I'm sure we're all familiar with all the kits and everything. Those were kind of what club really started propelling things that were intricate and detailed with more accurate hardware, so that people could actually do. This is one that I did way back in the day, but you just really had a sense of accomplishment that you had created a really fine piece of miniature with working parts and hardware. But I think House of Miniatures in the 70s was really that started pushing us more towards things that looked visually accurate and detailed.
Right. Even today, the House of Miniatures, I think they're really good. They're well proportioned. They're well crafted. They're good pieces. I get fooled sometimes. I'm like, that's nice. I mean, it is nice, but it's made by someone in their basement, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and I looked up the whole House of Miniatures thing and how it, they went out of business in the early 80s, and then they were purchased by Houseworks, which also did
Oh yeah.
some kits and miniatures, and then they got bought out by well, you know, Houseworks also did doors and windows and a lot of things to help you do a more detailed house, as opposed to your husband or grandpa out in the garage building a house out of plywood. But Hobby Builder Supply owns all the rights and bought out all their inventory and everything now, and I guess they still have a little bit left. But
yeah. Oh, so Houseworks owns the House of Miniatures. They own all of those. They should bring that back. Although there are a lot of kits on the market though right now that still
I
think
sold. Almost every garage sale or estate sale I go to, you know, they always have a bunch of boxes. It must have been, I wasn't ever a member of the Miniature of the Month Club, but there's a ton out there, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't afford it. It was pricey back then. I could not afford it. So I would have loved to have had that monthly, you know, kit in the mail. So what I wanted to ask you was, you know, as life goes on, we're gonna find that these pieces are harder and harder to come by. Do you find that? And you know, like everything has a cycle. Do you feel like there's more interest for the vintage pieces? Where is your head at in terms of where these pieces and these brands are? Is there a sense that you need to get on it now? Like, where are you at on that?
Yeah, definitely. One of the other things I collect is Petite Princess.
Oh yeah.
And it's plastic, but it's from the 60s. And the prices I've seen that just skyrocket. I think, you know, as styles and trends kind of go, and we're sort of maybe getting back into a 1970s feel with furniture and fashion and stuff like that. That stuff is all now in vogue again. So I've seen stuff like that happen with that brand. But I think there are still collectors who like the old 1940s and 50s Chestnut Hill and Strombecker pieces. And,
Well, there's certainly an emotional attachment going back to the shoebox at your grandma's. You know, at the end of the day, there is a really strong emotional attachment to these treasures. And sometimes it's not about how it looks and the aesthetic behind it. It's just how it makes you feel. And
definitely.
And when I see these pieces come past my you know, when I see them, I'm like, someone's gonna love that. Someone's gonna be interested in that. It's not necessarily my personal, but I get it why people would want these treasures, you know?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of people maybe have sort of a sense of worth or accomplishment too when they work with these, or they build these, or they collect these, and I think they probably want that for other people. That's probably a whole other topic, but I've contemplated that myself. You know, I don't think my kids want any of my miniatures, but
right.
But I think they'll be
something to think about,
worth
though.
Something
Yeah, no, that is a whole nother topic, and I definitely come across people all the time, like, you know, what am I going to do with my collection? You know, because the other thing is, you know, you spent a lot of time curating this collection, and you know, you want it to be ushered to the next good place where people can appreciate it the way you have. So I get that, and you know, and I tell people all the time, have a plan. You know, make sure your family and your friends know that this was important to you. And, you know, when you're not here, you're no longer here, you know, don't just trash it.
Right. Definitely.
Because a lot of people have no sense at all of what a fine miniature is, or, you know, a clunky, blocky miniature. It's all in the same pile, but it's all about what that meant to you. And you want to make sure that that's honored. So yeah, that is a whole other conversation. So what is next for you? I mean, you have this really strong social media following. You've got this awesome Instagram account, which is Tulsa Tiny Stuff. I know you have a blog post that you write, and you have a Facebook page. You know, did I cover all the places people can find you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I've written a few magazine articles too. So it's always good to subscribe to those periodicals on antique and vintage miniatures.
Yeah,
I don't know. I did. Go ahead. I was going to say I recently acquired this Beacon Hill house, and so I'm going to be doing something with that. I think I'm actually, a lot of my Victorian stuff that I started collecting back in the 80s, I think I'm going to do something with that.
Yeah, you'll
But-
find a place for it. That's what I love about your Instagram account. It's not just throwing really pretty pictures out there. There's an educational component to it, which I really, really
thank
like
you.
and appreciate for sure. For sure. So it's just so much more varied and interesting, and you just learn a lot. And you've just got all this great knowledge. So I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. This has been really, really good. So, the other question I was going to have before we wrap this up is, do you go to shows and do you attend the miniature shows to find your pieces?
We do. We haven't recently, but a show here in Oklahoma. We actually have a Tulsa miniature club that I belong to. I'm
Awesome.
teaching the class this month. I've been preparing for that.
Oh, that's great.
So I've been going to that for years. Actually, I used to take my daughter, and so it was kind of a bonding thing, but it was fun. We're gonna do some little lamps this month. I have been to the Dallas show a couple of years. I really enjoyed that. I've taken a couple classes there.
Great.
The other shows Chicago are kind of on my bucket list. That's on
Chicago. And maybe filling in the guild show. Write them all down. You got to get there.
Someday.
It's a lot to do. Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for spending time with me today and sharing your knowledge. And I look forward to seeing more of your awesome stuff on Instagram. And thank you so much. And thank you everybody at home for joining. I appreciate this. All right.
Thanks,
have a great rest of your day wherever you are. Okay. Take care.